I painted this still life using nothing but inexpensive acrylic craft paints. They're cheap and easy to find, but the question is, how do they hold up compared to professional acrylics? Let's find out. I normally draw with acrylic markers, but this time I'm using a mechanical pencil. I find the graphite is easier to erase than a typical pencil. And I'm also concerned about how well the craft paint will cover over the lines. So I really don't want to start with like a really dark marker drawing because I might have trouble covering over it. This is 11 by 14 and I'm using a grid to draw from a photograph. And the grid does help with the accuracy. I have acetate and I drew the grid with a marker. I'll talk about these lines later, but the idea is you could just focus on one square at a time. And I also think about negative shapes. So if I look at this one square right here, I can concentrate on drawing this shape right here rather than thinking about the shape of the knife. It's kind of like drawing negative shapes rather than the positive shape of the knife. It just makes it easier to see what these shapes actually are rather than think about what the shape of this is or what the shape of a tomato is. I also used a compass to draw the circle for the plate. I could draw it by hand, but it's so much faster just to use a compass. I also drew a smaller circle for the inside rim of the plate. And the interesting thing is this plate in reality isn't actually a circle. You can see that this right side here extends by quite a bit compared to a true circle. And I figured out where the center of the circle is by using geometry with the compass. If you're interested, I could make a video about different drawing tricks for painters, including like different geometry techniques. Leave a comment below if you'd like to see me make that video. The center of the circle is very close to this horizontal line right here, and that helped me sort of place the compass right here, and then I used that to draw the circle. There's a few sections that I reworked. These basil leaves were a little bit too long, so I brought them in. You can see the ghost lines right here where I erased it. But I also think that the lines of the wood aren't totally parallel. I think this line goes up a little bit too high on the left, so I might erase this and lower it a little bit. The whole point of doing a drawing before you start painting is that if I had to correct the shape of these leaves after I painted it, I'd have to remix all those colors and repaint it. But shifting a line in pencil is super easy. I prefer using a kneaded eraser to erase my lines because these erasers tend to leave crumbs and then you have to brush them off. They call it kneaded eraser because you can knead it into different shapes. And once one part gets dirty, you could just sort of knead it into the rest of the eraser. But the other cool thing is you can create little shapes that help you get into tighter sections. I don't have to totally erase this, but it's just good to get it lighter so I can tell which line to follow when I'm painting. I just used a bit of masking tape to mark the distance between these two lines. So that was off by quite a bit. You can download this reference photo by signing up for my free email newsletter. The link is in the description below. I bought two different types of craft paint. There's Cali Art acrylic paint. This is the 24 color set. And this is the Craft Smart set of 16 colors. I think I'm going to start with the Cali Art colors. And that's because there's a lot of colors in here that are similar to artist colors, such as cobalt blue, yellow ochre, burnt sienna, and so on. And they also have the pigment codes on the front here, so it seems like they use actual pigments. So this isn't true cerulean blue. It seems like they made this from other colors. That PW6 is titanium white. That might be phthalo blue and some other color. So I'll squeeze some of these colors out and I'll start mixing the color of the tomato. The one thing about these kits is there's a ton of different colors in there. So there's crimson. I need some warm colors like oranges and reds, so I'll use orange and the crimson, magenta, medium yellow, lemon yellow. And I'll probably need some blues to dull it down a little bit. Maybe I'll try the cobalt. And of course you need some white. Maybe I'll work in some of the Craft Smart colors later on just to see how they work. But for now I'm going to use these Cali Art colors. Scarlet and vermilion might be good colors to start off with for the tomato. So I'll squeeze some of that out. I'd say these are like soft body acrylics. It's not like the heavy body that leaves texture in there when you brush it on. It's a little bit more fluid. These colors are very similar. So let's see, maybe a little bit more white. And I think maybe this yellow is more orange. So let's see how that works. So I'll try to mix up some of this color. Yeah, it's pretty fluid. It needs white. I'm going to do the middle part of the tomato first, I think. And just like my video about how I broke my painting rules, I'm going to start with the most difficult section and work on it until it's complete before moving on. So it needs to go much lighter. It's kind of surprising how light this is. Maybe a little bit more yellow. It's not too bad for some sections. I think a little bit more red. I do think I need some sort of magenta. I probably should be using the Stay Wet palette to keep these wet, but I'll just mist them with water. So here's a spray bottle and I'll just give it a light mist. I'll just start on the center of this tomato and paint these sections in. This is a lot like fluid acrylics. It goes on rather smooth. So I'm starting with this lighter color because the center of the tomato is lighter. I might add variation to this later, but I think if I just put some solid color in here, that'll be a good start. I am seeing the pencil lines in here underneath the paint, so I could put it in a little bit thicker, see if that helps. Otherwise, I'll have to put on a second coat. So I have most of this lighter section filled in on this bottom tomato. And while I have this color in my brush, I might as well fill in this other tomato. That way you clean your brushes less often and it just seems more efficient. That's the lighter color for the top tomato. Now I'll start mixing the color for the outside edge. So it has more red in it, maybe a little bit more of the orange. And notice I don't need to wash my brush because it's so similar in color. That's pretty close, maybe a touch of yellow. For the darker sections, I could just add a little bit of blue in there. So I'll start with that and see how that goes. I think that's pretty close. I'm adding a little bit of black to this red to make it darker. And that's for this darker section here, where the seeds are in the tomato. It gets quite a bit darker on this side. And while I'm at it, I might as well do this section here. It's not quite as dark, so I added some of the red. I'm going to take a minute and focus on eliminating all these white gaps in here. So I'll just fill this in real quick. I'll let that dry and put a second coat on there, but for now, I'll work on the plate, and I figure I'll use some of these CraftSmart paints. I'll squeeze them out and see how they compare. If you're just getting started with acrylics, I put together a full art supplies course that walks you through all the supplies that you need. I compare the different types of paints, palettes, brushes, and other essentials. It's designed to save you time, money, and frustration as you're starting out. I'm currently offering it for free. Check the description below to see if the coupon is still valid. I'll start on the dark brown color of the rim of this plate. So I'll use black and the brown, maybe a little bit of red. It's actually not a bad start. And this is like the darkest section. They seem pretty similar to the Cali Art paints. It's not like they're any more opaque or anything. The first layer of paint is where you can reinforce your pencil lines and make corrections too. So I'm just trying to paint around the stem of this basil just to make it more obvious where the negative shapes are. The plate color is like this muted purple grayish color. That's the thing, is you don't want to use totally neutral grays in your paintings because it looks lifeless. So that's actually pretty close. So that's the color right there. It's not totally neutral. It does have some color to it. The outside edge of the plate is like this off-white color. I'll put that in next. So I'll just start with white and some brown, maybe a little bit of this yellow. It's not too bad to start with. Maybe a touch of blue, maybe some of the red. It's not too far off. I think some areas are a little bit more warm. I'll try that. Maybe a little too yellow. Add some blue in the red. That'll make it more grayish. That's a little better. You have to make sure the paints stay wet. I'll work on the wood handle next, and I'll use some of this color from the tomato, which is pretty close actually. What I noticed between craft paints and like professional paints is they don't cover as well. I could try the CraftSmart red and add some of the blue to it, maybe a little bit of brown. The problem with trying to compare different brands of paint is that you have to compare the same pigments. Because something like a phthalo blue is very transparent, whereas an ultramarine blue is a little bit more opaque. So you have to compare apples to apples. But what I do notice is these craft paints, they don't cover as well. There might be a couple different reasons for that. And one of the reasons is the professional grade acrylics have more pigment in them. This might look a little dark, but the highlight is actually darker than pure white. I've got the first layer in, and I think I'll come back in and put a second coat on it. That way I can build up the color and make it more opaque. It also gives me a chance to refine some of the shapes and add more details. I'm using this off-white color for the color of the seeds, putting those in there just to lock in those highlights. It took some time to refine the bottom tomato. You can compare it to the top one where there's more streaks. That's where you can add a lot of detail and refinement, is when you go over the top of an existing layer. I'll continue on with the top tomato and I'll move on to the plate after that. This vermilion color is pretty close to the brightest parts of the tomato. I'm using it to reinforce the outside edges, just to make it a little bit more vivid. It's these white highlights that make the tomato look like it's wet. These tomatoes are mostly done. I'll come back and put some finishing details in there, but I'm moving on to the plate. And I think the next step with the plate is to add in some of these speckles, and that comes from the glaze on the ceramic dish. One way to do that would be to thin the paint out with water to create a glaze. That way you can put like a thin wash down. I could add even more water here. It's a little bit more transparent. The glazing creates like a softer, like watercolor look. It's more subtle than painting in opaque areas. I took a day off and these paints are still pretty much wet. Yeah, the brown is wet. Even these thin areas are still wet. Even without the sponge, I was able to keep these craft paints wet just because I misted them with water before I closed it up. I also missed the lid a little bit just to keep the humidity up higher. Before I continue on with the rest of this plate, I'd like to put in some of the background color in. Right now this looks a little bit too dark, but I think when I put this background color in, it'll look more normal. So the background color will help me to determine if I have these values right. This is the burnt sienna, and I think it's pretty close to the darker areas. I could use raw sienna or maybe the orange for the lighter areas. Burnt sienna, and this is the orange. This top section is even darker because it's in shadow. Oop. Sometimes when you get a color in an area that you don't want, you can quickly wipe it off with a wet rag or maybe even wipe it with your finger like I did here. It left a little bit of a ghost area, but if the color below it is completely dry, you can take a wet towel and just wipe it completely off. Sometimes that'll help you from having to repaint it, but the other benefit is you don't have a gob of paint drying on your painting. When you do paint over it, if that gob of paint is still there, you'll see that texture through the next layer, so it helps to wipe it away. I moved on to filling in the background. That's kind of the fun part, is that once you get the difficult part done, you could just block in the background area, which usually requires less detail. But with these craft paints, I found that even to just achieve a flat area of color, you need to put down a couple of layers to build it up. The first layer of burnt sienna was streaky. You could see every single brushstroke. My strategy was to create a solid area of color and then put the wood grain effects on top of that. So it took multiple steps to make this look like wood. I started working on the basil because I felt like that was the next thing that needed to be done. The basil shape is just this big white shape, and I figured I should probably put in the green just to get it started. The green is pretty muted. It has some reds in there just to make it duller. If you use a very vivid green, it just won't look natural. And one of the issues I had with the craft paint is that the colors aren't as vivid as what you can get with either a professional acrylic or even a student grade acrylic that's made by a reputable brand. The way that this came through in this painting demo is that the yellow-orange color of the wood was difficult to achieve. I feel like my final painting looks more muted than it would look if I were to use professional grade paints. The colors are a little bit more muddy. These are some swatches that I did for my course about acrylic painting supplies for beginners. I compared the craft paints to Liquitex Basics and Golden Open Acrylics. The craft paint looks a little bit more flat and it has more white in the colors. The student grade paints have a jump up in the vividness, and the professional grade paints have more options where you can have very opaque colors. I'm using this straight edge to paint the lines of the wood planks. In watercolor painting, this type of brush is called a rigger because you use it to paint the rigging on ships, such as ropes and things like that. You do have to thin the paint down slightly just so that it flows better. I also used it to paint in some of the marks and the knots in the wood. This is like a knotty pine that this table is made from. I always mention that there's a point within the painting process that it helps to do a reset. The palette will start getting clogged up with paint and you have no more room to work. I want to work on this tomato next, and there's no room to mix the different reds and greens that I need to paint this. So I'm using a painting knife just to scrape it off real quick. Most of this paint can't be reused because there's chunks of dry paint in there. If I were to use it, I'd have to pick them out of my painting, and that's very tedious. I put the base coat of red down on this tomato. I have to go over it more than once because these paints are streaky, they don't go down very thick, and the coverage isn't that great. So I find that I go over areas more than once. And while the red is drying, I'm going in and putting some of the green on the stem. I'm starting with the darkest green on the stem, and I'll switch over to the lighter color. I have all the colors filled in, but I have to go over it again just to get rid of all the streakiness. It might sound like a broken record, but that's my main complaint about these paints, is it's very hard to get good coverage. There's all these streaks in this tomato. After that, it'll be mostly refinement. I have to smooth out these colors and add details. This is like the tedious part. Once you have everything blocked in, it's a matter of making smaller and smaller steps. So when I add this red to it, it's not very opaque. Even these darker areas start showing through. So I feel like there's a lot of repainting that happens with these paints. In order to get a solid area of color, it seems like I have to go over them a number of times to smooth it out. Even these darker sections start showing through when I go over it with the lighter red. Let's do a comparison with professional soft body cadmium red medium. Liquitex used to make soft body in tubes like this. Now it's in bottles. but it's the same type of paint. I'm using the soft body because it's pretty similar in consistency to a craft paint. And this is ultramarine blue. This is the original bottle they came in. This is even older. And now they're back to bottles, but they're different. Anyway, here's the ultramarine blue. It's a little bit thicker because it's old. Let's see how the red straight from the tube covers. This is the tomato. There's streaks in it. And see how easily that covers over the previous areas? That makes painting a lot easier. To make that darker, I'll add a little bit of this ultramarine blue in here. See how that made that darker? There's some glare on there because of the texture. If I move it closer up, you can see that that covers much better than these areas. And this red is more vivid. I feel like if I were to use these professional grade paints, it'd be much faster to paint this tomato in. With the craft paints, the first layer is super streaky, and then correcting it is hard too because you can see through the additional layers. And if you compare that to a professional grade paint that has an opaque pigment such as cadmium red, it's much easier to paint over those areas. Craft paints might be inexpensive, but what you save up front, you often pay back in time, covering the same area 2 or 3 times just to get the same effect. They're great for craft projects, which is why they're so popular, but for painting, I found it takes more effort to get subtle effects. In my course, I break down the real cost per ounce and per gallon across 3 different types of acrylics. Professional paints are the most expensive, but they give the best results. Student-grade acrylics are a great middle ground. You get much better performance without spending as much. I'm working on putting in some of the wood grain. I start by mixing in some water so that the paint is more transparent. This is kind of like a brownish black color. Then I put in the wood grain with like a liner brush. To soften it up, I take a brush that's a little bit wet and work into it. If you scrub it enough, you can totally erase it, but I just want to lighten most of these lines. And once that dries, it will be more subtle than if I just put down lines and left them the way they were. So I'm going to continue to do that to the rest of these planks to build up some textures, and it should look more like wood grain. I also put in some of the darker colors for the knots that are in the wood. I need to do more of that down here, but this is a tedious process. I'll just continue working on it. Building up transparent layers of acrylic like this is called glazing. And you can use this technique to build up much more subtle effects than if you were to use acrylic paint straight from the tube. Glazing is one of the strengths of acrylic painting because it dries so quickly. You can easily build up multiple layers of glazes within the same painting session. Oil paints take a long time to dry, so if you put down one glaze, you might wait a full day or even a couple of days before it's safe to paint over the top of it again. The fact that the craft paints are transparent actually kind of helps with this technique. So that's something to keep in mind when you're working even with professional acrylics, is that you can water them down to make them transparent. There are glazing mediums, and that's just basically like gloss medium, but with some other additives in it. And what that does is it makes the paint layer stronger because you're increasing the amount of binder that's within the paint film. I put in most of the wood texture and touched up the tomato a little bit more. Now I'll go back and put some more detail into the knife and the tomatoes. I always feel like I gravitate towards the area that needs the most work at the current moment. Originally that was the table area, but now I feel like I could probably improve this a little bit more. So here's an example where I accidentally got some paint onto the painting. And here I'm just taking a wet rag and wiping it off before it dries. The layer underneath was dry, so it didn't really disturb it as I wiped it off. The big question is when you're working on a painting is, when is it done? And I feel like I could call this done, but I decided to add more details, especially in the focal point. So I worked on the plate and the tomatoes a little bit more, and I can show you the before and the after, and you can see it does add some depth and enhance the focal point a little bit more. The one thing I noticed is that these are very matte. They don't have a lot of gloss to them. So it almost looks like a matte acrylic or like a gouache. The colors aren't quite as vivid as what I would get with a professional acrylic. I feel like some of the reds or the oranges could be more vivid. I noticed that with the professional cadmium red medium was more vivid compared to either of the reds that I got with these kits. Here's another test I'd like to perform. This is just a plain white towel. Sprayed a little water on here, and I'm just seeing if I can lift some of the pigment off. There is a slight amount of pigment on there. It's not a lot. What if I scrub the edge? So some of that pigment does come off. To me, that suggests that I either thinned the paint out too much for the top layer, or there's just not a lot of binder within these paints. Let's try that with this painting. I'm not getting anything on here. I use the same basic painting techniques and I don't see any paint coming off of this. Here are some frequently asked questions about acrylic craft paints. Can I use acrylic craft paints on canvas, or is it just meant for craft projects? Most of these brands say that you can use them on a variety of surfaces, including wood, paper, and canvas. In fact, CraftSmart lists it right on their label. Wood, bisque, canvas, clay, resin, terracotta, and more. Soap and water cleanup may stain some surfaces. So the answer is yes. Do acrylic craft paints work for glazing, dry brushing, and other acrylic painting techniques? The answer is yes. In fact, I've used some of those techniques within this painting. I use glazing to create this wood texture in the background, so the answer is yes. Do acrylic craft paints dry as fast as regular acrylics? Yes, for the most part. It depends how thick you apply them onto the canvas. If you apply thicker layers, it dries slower. There are some professional acrylics that will dry slower, but for the most part, I would say they dry about the same rate as regular acrylics. Are craft paints good for beginners? The benefit of craft paints is that they're cheap and they're readily available. There's a number of colors within each set, so you don't have to mix as much. But there will be a point where you will hit the limitation of using craft paints. There isn't as much pigment in the paint, and more advanced techniques are more difficult to pull off with inexpensive paints. So if you're just curious about acrylic painting, there's no harm in starting off with these paints just to get your feet wet. But once you get serious, I recommend upgrading to something like Liquitex Basics or some other student-grade acrylic. One question that comes up quite a lot is, why are craft paints so much less expensive than professional-grade acrylics? That largely has a lot to do with the pigment. Pigments used in professional-grade acrylics are a much higher quality. They're selected for how light-fast they are, which means they won't fade over time. Professional acrylics have a higher pigment load, which means there's more pigment within a tube of paint. That will give you better coverage and the colors are more vivid. Some of the pigments used in professional paints are rare and that makes them more expensive. If you look at some of the craft paints, they don't use cobalt blue and they also don't use things like cadmium. That's the main focus with craft paints, is that they're geared towards hobbyists, so price is like the main consideration and they formulate their paints so they're less expensive. Can you use craft paints for a finished painting or are they just for practice? It depends on the brand of craft paint. I think these Cali Art have a light fast rating on there, so that gives you some sort of reassurance that it shouldn't fade too easily. There are other brands, they don't list the light fastness rating and the quality of the paint isn't as good. So to answer the question is, you can use them. You have to consider though, how long do you want the painting to last? If you're painting for yourself or for friends and family, it shouldn't be too much of a problem. If you're doing commissions or selling your work, I would consider switching to a student grade acrylic that actually has light fastness ratings on the tube. Are acrylic craft paints safe to use indoors? These are all listed as non-toxic and I don't notice any fumes coming from there. They're water soluble and you clean them up with soap and water. None of these recommend having ventilation, so they should be safe to use indoors. Can you mix acrylic craft paint with acrylic mediums or professional grade acrylics? I don't see any reason why you couldn't do that. You can mix different brands of student acrylics or professional acrylics. Adding professional grade mediums might actually help the craft paint in that it'll give it a stronger paint film when it dries. If you'd like to see how student and professional acrylics compare, I've got a few related videos. How to blend acrylics like oils, how to blend student acrylics like oils, and my demo of golden open acrylics, which are a game changer. You'll find all of them linked here.